Support for the state of Israel was once something that you kind of tended to unite American Jews. I think that there's a much fiercer and deeper divide than often the American Jewish establishment wants to admit. What we need to do is align with people of all different backgrounds, right? In a movement that brings together Palestinians and Jews and people of every background around the basic principle that human beings deserve equality under the law, they deserve freedom. I think we have to fight to make the impossible possible, and I think we have precedents of movements for justice that have been able to do that in circumstances where the prospects looked just as dire.
We got a great interview for you guys. Now, Peter Beinart has Beinart's notebook on Substack. He's actually one of the better thinkers really throughout my career. I don't know if Peter knows that I think that about him, but he just found out. He has a new book out, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. I really want to talk to him about that. And he's also the editor-at-large at Jewish Currents. So Peter, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you.
So Peter, I've always loved your work, smart, compassionate, moral, and you did it again with this book. First, tell the audience what you mean by being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza.
Well, I mean, I think that what Israel has done in Gaza, which is, as you know now, kind of widely recognized as a genocide, is not just a moral catastrophe. It's a spiritual catastrophe for those of whom try to live in accordance with Judaism. What does it mean for us when a state that speaks in the name of the Jewish people, that deploys all of the symbols and many religious texts of our tradition, is doing that in the pursuit of mass ethnic cleansing and indeed of genocide? I think this is going to be the greatest spiritual crisis for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And I think we've barely begun to grapple with it. For Americans, it will be another massive kind of crisis in terms of kind of what it means for any possibility of America having any legitimacy in the world. But in a way, the Jewish question is an even more intimate question for me. And that's why I wrote this book specifically towards other Jews.
Yeah, so and that's why it's an extra blessing. So I want to break it down, but first, it's interesting because Yuval Harari, and my other favorite writer, also said the same exact thing you did, or it feels like it was the same thing, where he said, look, we had 2,000 years and then some of Jews being the victims of injustice and fighting past it and then helping others. And I'm adding now, right? Helping the civil rights movement and helping, by the way, Muslims during the Muslim ban that Trump tried, et cetera. And the ADL was great on that. And he's like, now after Gaza, are we going to be known as militaristic? You know, I don't think he used the word oppressors, but something along those lines. And is that how the world is going to see Jews going forward? So what's your sense of that? How much damage has been done to how people, and there's a couple of different things here, how people perceive Judaism and then Judaism itself, right?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think there has been a kind of a cancer that, especially since 1967 in the United States, has really entered into the American Jewish establishment and American Jewish discourse. And it is essentially the centrality of the idea that allegiance to the state of Israel is the definition of what makes you a good Jew, a Jew in good standing. And so in many Jewish communities in the United States, for really most of my life, the question that people ask about someone and whether they're living the right kind of Jewish life is not whether they keep Shabbat or whether they keep kosher or whether they visit the sick or whether they give a charity to the poor, wash the bodies of the dead, any of these things which are ancient and central to Judaism, but it's whether they basically unconditionally support this state. And I argue in the book that I think actually is a kind of an idolatry. It's a kind of worship of the state, the treating of a state, which is something human made, as if it is a God, it is godlike. You know, how often are we told before we can enter any conversation about Israel and Palestine, we have to accept Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Jewish tradition, as I read it, does not believe that states have inherent rights or inherent dignity. It's human beings who have the right to exist. States are only instruments for the protection of human beings. But in so much Jewish discourse, that has been completely flipped. So Israel's right to exist with this supremacist political system is considered sacrosanct, right? The right of Palestinians to exist, to live, is considered much less important.
Yeah, so there's some Orthodox sects, I lose track, I'm sure you know, obviously, that were always against the creation of Israel. And I always thought it was kind of funny, right? Like, oh, those are Jews against Israel. But it turns out they might have been right. And that's why we have the First Amendment in America, because when you combine state and religion, it poisons both.
Yes, I mean, there were a variety of reasons and kind of textual readings about this, but there was also a suspicion of nationalism, right? And of the impact of nationalism. We live in an age now. This is not just a Jewish thing. I think of extreme, horrifying hyper-nationalism. I mean, and I look at certain American conservative Christians, and I think these people seem to act as if you don't have an American passport, you're worthless. This seems also to me a kind of an idolatry, a worship of the state, and a losing sight of the as Abraham Joshua Heschel said, the only thing that's created in the image of God is the human being. And so yes, I think some of those Orthodox anti-Zionists had some of that understanding. And now, thank goodness, there's also a younger group of people, mostly progressive American Jews, who are saying, our belief is in equality under the law. We believe that human beings are created equal in the image of God, and that states should treat people equally under the law. That's what we're fighting against the Republican Party, over in the United States. And if we believe that, how can we possibly support a supremacist state in Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, so I want to get to that because ironically, I think you're tougher on Israel than I am when it comes to the ultimate, fix for this problem. But we'll come back to that in a second. Well, one thing I'm super interested in is the reaction of the Jewish community to this at large, right? So I'm not in the Jewish community. I don't, have my friends are Jewish, but it still doesn't. I don't go to synagogue. I don't go to temple, right? I'm not in the community. So. First, what's your sense of how it is these days? Like when we first, obviously after October 7th, 100% united, it was a tragedy, horrible, all of that, obvious, right? Now, the tragedies and the slaughter began pretty quickly thereafter. But again, all right, buffer zone for a period of time, 2 months, 6 months. There shouldn't be, there should never be a genocide. There should have never been that slaughter. But at least psychologically, emotionally, you need time to process it. And people are, the ethnic bias is the biggest bias. I know it applies to Turks just as much as anyone else, et cetera, right? But now 2 years in, so I don't want to make assumptions. What percentage, and I know you're guessing, right? Obviously, right? And it's super rough. But roughly what percentage of the Jewish community now goes, no, this isn't right. This isn't what we wanted. And what percentage are still like, nope, Israel's the answer, I forgot the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer that question. We don't have great polling. The kind of the questions that are asked in polling often don't really get at these things. I would first of all note just actually that there were people who started protesting within just days after October 7th, and many of those were Jewish-led protests because I think they weren't. I don't think it was because they didn't understand the horror of October 7th, but I think they understood what Israel was likely to do because Israel made that pretty clear from very early on. I think that there are a lot of people who have. There's one group of people who initially supported Israel's, military assault on Gaza after October 7th, and over time have grown disillusioned with it. But I think there's a more fundamental divide even underneath that, which is basically about the basic nature of the state. I mean, and I think it runs often along generational lines, and it's extremely divisive within many, many Jewish families. Support for the state of Israel was once something that you kind of tended to unite American Jews. Now I think it's actually something that really often divides American American Jews, but it's concealed a little bit because you see these Jewish organizational leaders going on TV, and they like to speak as if they represent the entire community, as if someone kind of made them pope, and they'll say the Jews feel this way. But we have polling which suggests that, for instance, among young Jewish New Yorkers, Zohran Mamdani has very, very widespread support. And Zohran Mamdani is basically an anti-Zionist, right? I mean, that's part of the reason he's so controversial, right? And so I think that there's a much fiercer and deeper divide than often the American Jewish establishment wants to admit, and often sometimes that the American media tends to admit.
Yeah. So when I was growing up, I grew up in a town that was nearly half Jewish, roughly speaking. We were Jewish enough, I've told the story many times before on the show, that I was on the football team, and when other teams threw bagels at us, right? And it was the 80s, it was Jersey, it happened, okay? So I grew, but the Jewish community I grew up in had two traits, okay? One was the wonderful decency and morality that you're talking about, and that I've seen in Jewish tradition over and over again. And it's not just the being great at the civil rights movement, looking out for other victims of injustice, etc. But it's also questioning the rabbi, emphasizing education. We don't listen blindly to authority figures, and because that's what among the many reasons why is because that's partly what led to the Holocaust and the pogroms and all that. When you blindly listen to authority figures, right? So I love that culture. But it also layered on top of that was a love of Israel and an unquestioning love of Israel. So now back then I didn't know that was in conflict, but honestly it's always been in some degree of conflict, right? But now after October 7th and the genocide that ensued after that, it's an open conflict, right? You can't say anymore, I'm for the victims of injustice and open-minded and open-hearted, etc. But it's 64,000 dead Palestinians at a minimum is not enough. I want more. 20,000 Palestinian kids dead, not enough. I want more. No, that's in conflict. You can't have both, right? So it's forcing people into a decision. And I'm just trying to get a sense of, I know the young are great. Jewish leaders in the peace movement, we've been given credit to from day one. They're great. They've always been great. So those are not in question. But in terms of like the heart of the Jewish community, where I'm trying to ascertain, and the reason I'm asking, Peter, is because it's politically so important. Because Jewish Americans can make such a giant difference here. So to what degree have they been moved by your argument and the folks on your side?
Yeah. Look, to be fair, I don't hear a lot of people saying we want 20,000 more dead. But unfortunately, the policies that they support end up bringing us to that situation, right? Because if you support continuing American arms sales and continuing Israel's assault on Gaza, that's where you're going to get, even if you say you don't want that. I think that the bulk of power in the American Jewish community still rests with people who basically support Israel unconditionally. They tend to be much better organized, they're older, they have more resources. But the good news is that I don't think that we have to have the balance of power in the Jewish community, those of us who have I think a kind of more equality-oriented perspective. What we need to do is align with people of all different backgrounds, right? In a movement that brings together Palestinians and Jews and people of every background around the basic principle that human beings deserve equality under the law, they deserve freedom. And what I see, I don't think the pro-Palestinian movement is perfect. I don't agree with every particular single slogan at every rally, but I think it has some of the dynamics of the great moral movements of our time, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the anti-apartheid movement. When I go around the country, I see people of all different backgrounds coming together around a basic solidarity about the idea of how human beings should be treated, and that gives me hope.
Yeah, I hear you, but ironically, I'm not getting the hope I was hoping for. So because I was hoping that at this point that a good percentage of the older folks had moved. And because I've seen in my life, middle-aged, first it was young Jews, then it was middle-aged Jews, and now some of the older Jews are moving and going, no, I didn't ask for this. And so and nobody got my permission, and no, this is not part of Jewish tradition. This is terrible, right?
Yeah.
So, but what you're saying leads me to believe, no, the power center has not moved much.
Look, the power center is based in, because American politics is so deeply corrupt, the power center within any is always essentially where the most money is, right? And that tends to be on the right on every issue. But there are very significant cultural changes. I'll just give you an example. Jerry Nadler, right, who's stepping down as the congressman in Manhattan, right, has really been at the absolute center of the organ of kind of American Jewish politics for decades now. Nadler has just said that for the first time ever, he is going to vote to condition military aid to Israel. For someone like Jerry Nadler, that's a massive shift. Even just a year or two ago, the number of Democrats in Congress who would have supported that was very, very small. Now it's become maybe half the Democrats in Congress. I interviewed a rabbi named Ismar Shor. He was for a couple weeks ago. He's in his 90s. His family fled the Holocaust. He was for 20 years the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is where the conservative movement within Judaism produces its rabbis. An extremely eminent figure within American Jewish life. What he said about this as a stain on Judaism, about literally the way that the synagogues will have to reckon in the same way that the Catholic Church reckoned with its horrors, there are people who come from the center who are also rethinking things.
Yeah. Okay, so then you got folks like Jerry Seinfeld. So we just covered it on the show today. Somebody asked him about Free Palestine. No, nobody asked him actually. He was giving a speech at Duke.
Yes,
he voluntarily, said, if you say Free Palestine, that means you hate Jews and you're worse than the Klan. So I find that to be mental. Like there's something deeply wrong with you. That if you think freeing Palestinians means you hate Jews, that's not just a slight on Palestinians, that's a slight on Jews, right? That if you love Jews, you have to imprison and enslave Palestinians. That's so insane to me. But I've seen the same kind of bias again in the Turkish community, right? So how is it being Jewish within the Jewish community these days when you are in favor of freeing Palestine? How do you have conversations with people like Jerry Seinfeld, whose brain apparently has melted?
I mean, look, I think the most fundamental thing that affects people is whether they actually have interactions with Palestinians that require them to listen to Palestinians. I don't know Jerry Seinfeld, but my assumption would be that Jerry Seinfeld has never read a book by a Palestinian author. He's never seen a film by a Palestinian. He's never had a serious political conversation with a Palestinian in which a Palestinian has said to him, "This is what happened to my family in 1948 when we were expelled by Israel. This is the consequences for my life. This is what it's like to live as a Palestinian under a condition that even Israel's own human rights organizations call apartheid." And what happens, unfortunately, in many parts of the Jewish community, I imagine this was true for Jerry Seinfeld, is people are constantly talking about Palestinians all the time without listening to Palestinians. And that is a recipe for dehumanization. The people who have come to a different view are those who actually engage with Palestinians and listen to them. And then I think they're able to overcome this kind of dehumanization, which is true in many, many different communities, the tendency to dehumanize the adversary. But when you look them in the eye and listen to them, I think that starts to melt away.
Yeah. I guess I'm a little bit more heartbroken, and not just about Seinfeld because I grew up watching Seinfeld, but by a community that I loved and has been great to me, and I believe in them. So as they continue to not bend, I get heartbroken again and again and again, right?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I mean, but I just think it's important to remember that in some sense, every community, racial, religious, ethnic community is divided by questions of values, and so it's always an illusion to think that there is some kind of unanimity within a population because they share some identity. Even though Jews may share a common set of traditions and a common set of experiences, we interpret those in dramatically different ways, right? And I see this in community after community, right? And so to me, the question, I think that non-Jewish people who care about Jews, and I'm glad they care about Jews, it's an illusion to think that you can stand in solidarity with Jews, right? What you have to do is you have to make your own decision about what are your values. You can't outsource your conscience. And then what you will find is that there are Jews who share those values, which are basically about human equality, and there are Jews who don't, just like there are Christians who do and Christians who don't, and Muslims who do and Muslims who don't, and Hindus who do and Hindus who don't. We're fully human, so we're no different than anybody else in that regard.
Yeah, so I of all the things we agree on, I couldn't agree more on that. Like that's the biggest agreement we have, of course. So first of all, it's irrational and honestly unintelligent to think that anybody in a different religious or racial group is different. No, we're all the same. We're all the same species, right? Obviously, right? So what happens is cultural shifts throughout time, and really it's more about power than it is about any particular religion or race. Because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so this is just and sometimes a matter of literally geography, which Harari writes about brilliantly. And so, okay, so I'm gonna get to Israel in a second because you and I think disagree on how to fix it, and that's an interesting conversation. But last thing on the community, and so as Peter is saying here, there is no the community, there is no the Jews, right? Everybody's different, and it's a variety of things. So when we talk about the community, we're in that case, I mean the power center, right? The folks who are exhibiting political power at this point, et cetera. So and we're both saying, like, or I shouldn't put words in your mouth. I was hoping for better from that portion of the community. Haven't gotten it yet, but
yeah. But I think it's also just. I mean, I think part of it is we need to remember. I mean, it would be a wonderful thing if having been historically victimized, immunized people from victimizing others, right? But unfortunately, that's not the case, right? It's not the case with Jews. It's not the case even in families. We see tragically that that's not the case, right? And so again, I just think that it's I wish this were the case as well, but there have always been Jews. I mean, my family is South African, right? That almost when Nelson Mandela was prosecuted at the Rivonia trial in 1964, all of the white defendants sitting alongside him were Jews, which was a source of immense pride for me growing up. But you know what? The apartheid prosecutor was Jewish as well, right? So wherever there are great moral struggles where Jews have access to power, you will see some Jews choosing the path of power and oppression and other Jews resisting it.
Again, of course, right? So in the civil rights movement, some of the top leaders were Jewish. On the other hand, Roy Cohn was Jewish. So
100%.
Right, and there's great Turks and there's evil Turks. Of course, right? Yes. So all right, last thing on the community, and then I want to go to Israel real quick. So what has been the reaction that you have gotten personally? Do people get it and they go, oh, Peter, I know you mean well, but God, you're so misguided. Or hey, you know what? Thank you for at least representing this side. And I know the reaction is going to be different based on who you're talking to, but give us a general sense of it.
Yeah, I would say there's a range. I mean, there are people for whom, there are people who see this, people like me as traitors, right? And see that Jews need, and so nobody likes a traitor. And there are other people who might accept that I'm arguing from a position of goodwill, but they think that I'm deeply, deeply naive in my view of the world and my view of Palestinians. And then there are other people who feel appreciative because they feel like they've been so upset and alienated themselves, and they appreciate the fact that they're seeing articulated some of this alienation. Again, oftentimes it's on generational lines. Sometimes, a lot of times, I've had people say, I'm giving this book to my father or my uncle or my grandmother so that we can have a conversation about this because the generational divide is so great.
Yeah, and remember, guys, the book is Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza: A Reckoning. And of course, Peter also writes on Substack at Beinart Notebook. So Peter, then let's move over to, and by the way, you had a great conversation with Jon Stewart where you went, guys, had the same experience because you think about it in the same moral way. Again, I'm not allowed to say it, but if I was allowed to say it, I'd say I think you guys are closer to the real Jewish tradition, at least the one that I am familiar with. But anyways, that's for others to decide. Okay, so let's move to Israel. I'm in favor of a two-state solution. You're saying one state. So to make the case for one state.
Sure. I guess for me, less important than whether it's one state or two states is that I believe that wherever Jews and Palestinians live together, they should live under the same law. That I don't believe in states that give certain people legal supremacy based on religion or ethnicity or race. So I don't believe in the idea of a Jewish state in the same way I don't believe in the idea of a Hindu or Christian or Muslim state, because I think that fundamentally violates the core principle of liberal democracy, which is equality under the law. So that's my fundamental problem. I think that Palestine, one of the basic ideas behind the idea of a Jewish state is it has to have a large Jewish majority, because if you don't have a large Jewish majority, Jews won't be running things. Well, if we think about it in the United States, who are the Americans who talk about maintaining our demographic majority, right? Those aren't people that we share values with. So if I don't like Tucker Carlson and all these guys talking about maintaining a white Christian majority in the United States and having an immigration policy based on that, how could I support that principle in Israel? Especially because Israel, more than half the Palestinian population in 1948 was expelled. And in order to maintain a Jewish majority, you have to say that none of those people or their children or grandchildren have the right to come back. How can I tell those people that I, as a Jew, have the right to return to this place after 2,000 years, but they can't return after 75 years? It seems to me to violate the principles of human equality that I believe in everywhere. I can't make an exception for my own people if I genuinely believe in this principle.
Okay, I hear you, and especially now I've come to believe that, yeah, an ethno-state is just a disastrous idea. And I'm an atheist, and so Muslim states, I do not want to live in something that calls itself a Muslim state or any kind of state. But if you say it about, of course, a Jewish state, then they're going to call you an anti-Semite, blah, 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 etc. Right? But so I get it, not a great idea to begin with, because you're going to have to maintain your majority somehow. And that's going to be a problem, and it makes it racial and discriminatory by definition, right? So I get it, and I'm convinced of that. But the reality on the ground is, Israel is never ever going to accept a one-state solution. They're never ever going to willingly be outvoted by the Palestinians. So it's not realistic, is it?
Well, look, at this point, certainly not. Nor is a two-state solution realistic. There's almost nobody in his mainstream Israeli politics today who supports a sovereign Palestinian state, and Israel is racing to make one impossible with massive settlement growth and is on the verge of annexing a lot of the West Bank. I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but I would just add this one cautionary note. It was inconceivable to most white Americans as late as the 1940s that we would have an army where it was routine for white soldiers to take orders from black officers. As late as the 1980s, it was inconceivable to most white South Africans that you could have an election that would produce a black man be the president of that country. Great movements for justice. It was inconceivable when I was growing up that the Soviet Union would not dominate Eastern Europe. Great movements can make something that is inconceivable in one moment in history conceivable in the next. I don't know whether this will happen in this case. It could be that we who believe in Jewish and Palestinian liberation fail, and that Israel succeeds in destroying much of the Palestinian population. But I think we have to fight to make the impossible possible, and I think we have precedents of movements for justice that have been able to do that in circumstances where the prospects looked just as dire.
Yeah, so I hear you on that, but let me ask you one last hypothetical. So the Arab coalition basically has a peace plan that certainly I would take. And the core of it, if we're just cutting to the chase, is two-state solution, no right of return for the Palestinians, but they get West Bank and Gaza Strip. They don't get all of it, but they get some healthy percentage that they could live with, right? Barely live with. I would take that deal. Would you take that deal?
Well, it's really up to the Palestinian people to decide what they want. I mean, the Arab League initiative, which was, comes out of from 2003, actually calls for a Palestinian state on the entirety of the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, and what they call a just and agreed upon solution to the refugee question. So it doesn't concede quite as much as what you're suggesting. Now, it might be in negotiations that Palestinians do decide that they would be better off accepting, giving up on the right of refugee return and accepting a state on just the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, or even some smaller amount of that with land swaps. But there has to be a legitimate process by which Palestinians come to that conclusion. And part of the problem is that Palestinians are not allowed to choose their leaders. Most of their most legitimate, popular leaders are sitting in jail. So if Palestinians make that decision that that's what they want, right? Just like in any movement of people who are denied basic freedoms, they decide they're going to make certain political concessions for the sake of reality, then I think that's legitimate. But I don't think it can be imposed upon them. I think Palestinians have to decide that for themselves. And it's also important to recognize that right now, a Palestinian state is not on offer. It hasn't been on offer at least for 15 years for Palestinians.
Well, obviously it's worse than that because the Israeli government voted to not ever allow a Palestine. So, you hope that they reverse that, but the current Israeli position is, no, we're going to imprison them, enslave them, whichever word you want to use, for the rest of time. Which is, again, it's given Jewish history, that is a shocking statement to make. That given what's happened to Jews throughout history, given what happened to Jews in Egypt, given what is said in Passover dinner, it's unbelievable, right?
Yes, you're right. But again, Judaism is a vast and ancient tradition. So we have voices that speak in incredibly powerful terms. These are the ones that mean the most to me about the inherent idea that all human beings are created equal in the image of God, that we should always remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt. But it's also the case that if you read Jewish texts, if you read Deuteronomy, if you read Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, you'll see things that may sound very genocidal. I mean, when Benjamin Netanyahu talked about Amalek and describes the Palestinians as Amalek, that's also quoting Torah. So again, just like Christians or Muslims and everything, we have an ocean of different voices within our tradition. The question is, which ones are we going to prioritize? What are our basic values? And that struggle is very, very, very fierce, I think, right now among Jews in the United States in particular.
Yeah, all right, one last question. And by the way, on the peace settlement, of course it's up to the Palestinians. And Israel has managed it so that you can't find a Palestinian leader to negotiate with because they've just labeled all of them terrorists, right? So then by definition, they don't allow for a negotiation, et cetera. And they say they don't ever want to give it anyway. But anyways, I would swap a little bit of land, not much at all. I would swap right of return and I would take the deal if it was up to me, because for God's sake, separate them, stop fighting, stop killing each other. And obviously the Palestinians need a state. Are they never going to have a state? That's insane. That's an insane position, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the question is, I think for me, the principle is that Palestinians deserve to be citizens of a state, whether that's their own independent state or whether that's the state in which they live now, which is the state of Israel. And they need to be citizens of a state. That's the basic foundation for having political rights.
Yeah. And if they don't want a two-state solution, then of course, then your side begins to win because it is one state. They're just drawing lines, right? And it's kind of saying like, okay, these are the ghettos, whether you fill in the blanks for whatever analogy you'd like from the past. And we've confined the Palestinians to these ghettos where they have no rights, and we could starve them anytime we want. We could kill them, detain them. They have no rights at all. And if that's Israel's plan, and if you're supporting Israel's plan to keep them in permanent ghettos, it's A, not going to work, it's B, it's disastrously immoral, right? And C, it's gonna lead to a one-state solution, because at some point, people are gonna go, well, they exist. Are you gonna give them rights or are you not gonna give them rights? And if you say you're never going to give them rights, then you're a dictatorial government, and you're a despotic government.
Right. Right, and I think again, unless you think you can do to Palestinians what we did in this continent to Native Americans and destroy the population, which is what I think the Israeli government would like to try to do. If you don't do that and you're having to live alongside, and God forbid Israel would be able to do that, that's what we must fight against. But if you're going to be living alongside Palestinians, I think a situation where you live alongside people who you brutally oppress is less safe for everybody. I think societies are safer when everyone has a voice in government. And I think that the people tend to take up arms when they have no nonviolent mechanism of having the government listen to them.
Yeah. All right. So the last thing is the one that some would consider even more controversial. So, look, so does AIPAC and the Israeli lobby have a disproportionate influence on Congress? I'm not asking that question to you because that's an empirical question, and the answer is yes. Overwhelmingly not close, just like the big pharma does, big oil does, etc. Right? So, okay. Is there any recognition, again, in the power centers of the community that is driving a lot more anti-Semitism? That people are seeing, oh yeah, AIPAC is clearly buying the members of Congress. Members of Congress are clearly doing what they are told by the donors, as they do with every donor class. Yeah, but they are also doing it here, right? And that is making people very, very angry. And and then of course folks say, oh no, that's a trope. But except it's actually happening here. So is there any recognition that they're actually accidentally driving up anti-Semitism?
I mean, I think that a lot of people are uncomfortable saying that publicly because they don't want to be giving the impression that justifies anti-Semitism, right? That the anti-Semites aren't responsible. Ultimately, if you're an anti-Semite, you're responsible for being anti-Semitic. But the way I would put it is, if we want to fight against anti-Semitism, right, which I think we need to do in partnership with all the other different kind of communities who are suffering bigotry, this is a terrible, terrible way to fight anti-Semitism, because what you do is you separate Jews from other people who need to be struggling for the principle of equality. And you basically have Jewish organizations go in partnership with these authoritarian, supremacist Republican Party, Trump groups, right? And so then you have them, destroying American universities in the name of keeping Jewish students safe, even though the vast majority of Jews on these campuses don't want the Trump administration to cut off and start censoring and destroying these universities. And you also have a situation, right, in which people start to hate AIPAC for the same reason that they hate all of these corrupt lobbies in Washington, because they're distorting American politics, undermining American democracy, and making it such that people's votes don't matter. And that's not ultimately in the best interests of American Jews. I mean, American Jews have prospered in America as America was moving towards greater democracy, greater equality under the law, right? This turn to corrupt American politics and move it in a less and less democratic direction, to make us less and less of a free society, is very bad for us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. All right, I love that your voice is out there, Peter, and please keep going. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for and not just to move fellow Jewish Americans in the right direction, the more moral direction, in my opinion, and for whatever it's worth, the more Jewish direction, in my opinion, but also for allowing us who want to fight against anti-Semitism to be able to point to folks like you and go, don't make assumptions. Right, so just because somebody's given money to AIPAC doesn't mean that they represent all Jews. Just because Mossad or IDF did something, they didn't call Peter Beinart, they didn't call John Stewart, they didn't call Dave, Ben, my friends, and say, oh, can I have permission to do this? No, they don't represent all of you guys, and thank you for being a shining light that is a good example to others.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
All right, everybody, you got to check out the book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning by Peter Beinart. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.